15 years alone will teach a man many things. How to patch a roof with one hand. How to mend a heart without ever touching it. How to make peace with silence so thick it could drown a storm. But even a man like Caleb Thornfield, who had made loneliness his gospel and built walls not of wood but of memory, wasn't ready for what waited that night. It wasn't the storm that rattled the porch beams or the thunder that split the Texas sky like judgment from above. It wasn't even the wind howling like lost souls across the prairie. It was her. She appeared like a ghost from the edge of the world, stumbling through the downpour, collapsing at his gate. A girl with a face too young for the darkness in her eyes. A girl soaked to the bone, silent, bruised, and broken, but not begging. And that was the part Caleb would never forget. She didn't plead. She didn't speak. She simply knelt, rain washing the dirt from her skin, but not the pain. He could have turned away. He almost did. After all, that's what 15 years of exile had taught him. That trouble wears many faces, and the most dangerous one is the kind you want to protect. But something in her silence spoke louder than any cry for help. And in that moment, standing barefoot on the porch of a life he thought was finished, Caleb Thornfield made a choice that would burn everything down and build something unexpected in the ashes. Because this isn't just a story about a girl on the run or a man hiding from his past. This is a story about what happens when two broken souls meet in the middle of a storm and decide they're done running. So stay with me, because in the next 30 minutes, we're going to walk through fire loss and redemption. We'll face men who believe women are property, and the one man who proved them wrong. And when it's over, you might just believe what Caleb did. That sometimes mercy doesn't come from above. It shows up in the mud and knocks on your door. The first thing folks noticed about Caleb Thornfield, if they ever noticed him at all, was how still he was. Not just in body, but in presence, like the air around him had learned not to stir without his permission. 15 years on that ranch, and not once had he gone into town unless it was necessary. Supplies, bullets, coffee beans, and maybe once a year, a bottle of whiskey he'd drink alone beside the fireplace, with no light but the glow of dying embers. That was how he marked time, not in birthdays or seasons, but in how many winters passed without a visitor. There was a time when Caleb had been the kind of man who laughed easily, who danced with girls at county socials, who kissed the back of a hand and meant it. But grief has a way of teaching silence, and his came heavy. A betrayal he never spoke of. A death he never mourned out loud. People talked, they always do, but no one knew the full story. Caleb made sure of that. He built the cabin himself, every nail driven with a kind of anger that looked like purpose. By the end of that first year, he'd turned the land into a fortress of solitude. A place not just to live, but to forget. There was no room for softness. Not in the cattle, not in the soil, and certainly not in his own heart. He taught himself not to miss voices, not to need company, not to want things he could no longer have. Even the sky seemed to understand. It often hung heavy over Thornfield Ranch, vast and gray, like it too carried something it couldn't let go of. The wind would whistle through the fence posts at night, but it sounded more like a warning than a song. Neighbors stopped coming around. He didn't mind. He told himself he didn't need people, and most days he believed it. But belief and truth aren't always the same. Because if you looked closer than most dared, you'd see the signs. The second cup on the kitchen shelf, unused but polished. The way he always brought too much bread. The moments when he'd pause at the sound of footsteps on gravel, only to remember that no one was supposed to be coming. Caleb Thornfield hadn't forgotten how to feel. He had just buried it. And like all things buried deep enough, it only took the right storm to bring it to the surface. That storm came on a Tuesday night, wrapped in thunder and cloaked in rain. And with it came a girl whose presence would force him to remember everything he worked so hard to forget. The storm came down like judgment. Rain beat the tin roof of Caleb's cabin with a ferocity that sounded like fists, like the sky itself was trying to shake the world awake. He stood on his porch arms, crossed coffee untouched beside him, eyes tracking the lightning stitching across the horizon. That kind of weather was enough to make even memories stir. But nothing could have prepared him for the silhouette that stumbled out of the dark. At first, he thought it was a coyote, just something wild and low slung against the wind. But then it stopped, staggered, knees gave out. A girl. She collapsed at the edge of his gate, soaked through and shaking not from the cold, but from something far deeper. Her dress clung to her frame like it was holding her together. Hair stuck to her face, but even through the rain and distance, Caleb could see the fear carved into every angle of her posture. She didn't scream, didn't knock, didn't even lift her head. She just knelt there. Still, like she'd come to the end of something. And maybe she had. Caleb's first instinct was the one he always followed: shut the door, lock it, walk away. Trouble wore many faces, and this one looked like it came with a story he didn't want to hear. But something in her stillness stopped him cold. There was no performance in it. No manipulation. Just surrender. Not the kind that comes with weakness, but the kind born from exhaustion. So complete even hope has grown quiet. He grabbed his rifle. Not to threaten, just to be ready. Caution was the only religion he still practiced. As he stepped through the rain boots, squelching through the mud, she didn't move. Not until he was within 10 feet. Then slowly, she lifted her face. She looked young. Too young. Barely grown, but already carrying something ancient behind her eyes. He saw it then, the bruises, purple, cruel things wrapped around her wrists like shackles left too long in the sun. Rope burns. Fresh. Her lips parted, and when she spoke, it wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "Please," she whispered. "I have nowhere else to go." There were stories buried in those 7 words. Entire wars, probably. But Caleb didn't press. He simply opened the gate. She tried to stand. Her legs failed her. He caught her before she fell. And just like that, the storm was no longer outside his home. It had stepped through the gate and taken the shape of a girl who smelled like rain fear, and something fragile he hadn't dared feel in years. Under the soft flicker of the oil lamp, the girl looked smaller than she had in the rain. Caleb sat across from her, nursing a cup of coffee gone cold while she wrapped trembling fingers around the steam of a chipped ceramic bowl. The stew, simple hot, had been ready for hours, as if some part of him had known she was coming. She hadn't said much since stepping through the door. Hadn't needed to. The story was written across her skin, like a map of every place pain had touched. Her name, when she finally offered it, was Mercy, and there was something bitterly poetic in that. Because Mercy was the one thing the world had clearly withheld from her. The bruises on her wrists told one kind of truth, but it was the way she avoided his eyes, the way she flinched at sudden sounds, that told another. There were ghosts at her heels, and none of them friendly. He asked nothing at first. Just let her eat, let her warm, let her breathe in air that didn't reek of fear. Sometimes that was the greatest kindness a person could offer space. No questions, no demands. But Mercy was already unraveling even in the silence. After a while she whispered, not because she wanted to share, but because she had nowhere left to put the weight. "My husband," she said. Just that, like it explained everything, and in a way it did. She didn't cry. That was what struck Caleb most. No tears, just this quiet grit. Every sob had already been cried out somewhere else. Somewhere darker. Somewhere she hadn't left yet. Not really. "How long were you married?" Caleb asked, his voice low, careful. 3 months, she said. Felt longer. There was no smile behind the sarcasm. Just numbness. The kind you get when you've screamed and no one listened. He wanted to ask more. What kind of man does this? Why didn't she leave sooner? But he knew better. Pain like that didn't grow overnight. And leaving someone who believes they own you, that takes more courage than most men could ever imagine. "You ran," he said softly. "I stole his horse, his money." "His pride," she replied. "He won't forgive that." There it was again, that steel behind her softness. Caleb felt something stir in his chest. Not pity, not even rage. Something older, something deeper. Respect. "You hungry still?" he asked, if only to give her something to hold on to. She nodded. "I'll get more stew." But as he stood, she said something that chilled him to the bone. He said he'd find me wherever I went, that there's no place on earth I can hide from him. Caleb froze. Who said that? She looked at him, then finally met his eyes. And there it was, the fear she'd been swallowing whole. My husband. Silas Hartwell. The name hit him like a hammer. He knew that name, and he knew this wasn't over. Caleb Thornfield had been out of the world for a long time. But even from his quiet corner of Texas, the Hartwell name still carried weight like the sound of a rattler in dry brush. You didn't need to see it to know it was dangerous. You just had to keep very, very still. Silas Hartwell. It wasn't just a name. It was a warning. The Hartwells were one of those families who mistook land for legacy and cruelty for strength. They didn't earn power, they inherited it, along with arrogance and a taste for control. Silas, the youngest of the bunch, had always been the most volatile. Caleb remembered him from years back, sharp suit, sharper tongue, and a temper that could turn a Sunday sermon into a fistfight. If Mercy had married into that bloodline, no wonder she ran. "You should have told me sooner," Caleb muttered, rising from the table to peer out the window. The storm was breaking now, but something worse was brewing. "You know him." Mercy's voice was small but not fragile. "I know enough," Caleb said, eyes narrowing at the distant tree line. "And if he's coming, we need to be ready." But even as he said it, the torchlight began to flicker in the dark, dozens of tiny orange teeth biting through the trees. They were already here. "Get away from the window," he said, voice low and steady, reaching for his rifle. Mercy backed into the shadows, her face pale and unreadable. "He brought them," she whispered. "His brothers, hired men. They'll burn the place down if they have to." Caleb knew she wasn't being dramatic. The Hartwells didn't ask questions. They made statements in fire fists and fear. And Caleb had just made himself their next example by sheltering the one woman they wanted to crush. "Under the kitchen," he said, moving fast. "Root cellar. Get down there. Don't make a sound." She hesitated. "What about you?" "I'm going to talk to your husband. You'll die." He turned, and for the first time she saw it, that steel in his spine, the resolve in his eyes. Maybe. But not before he learns the meaning of no. She started to protest again, but he was already pulling up the floorboards. Mercy dropped down into the dark, her last glance upward filled with something that hadn't been there before: trust. And as he replaced the planks, the last sound she heard before the door shut wasn't the storm, or the thunder, or the horses. It was Caleb whispering to himself, almost like a prayer. "I buried my past for 15 years. But tonight, it digs itself up." The door creaked open just enough for Caleb to step out onto the porch, his rifle cradled against his chest, not aimed, not yet. Rain still dripped from the eaves, but the storm itself had quieted, giving way to a more dangerous calm. The kind that came before a bullet found its mark. They stood there, 12 of them, spread out in a semicircle beneath the trees like a pack of wolves, waiting for a weak step. Some wore wide-brimmed hats and long coats slick with water. Others had bandanas pulled up over their mouths like outlaws, though Caleb doubted any of them had the stomach for real lawlessness. Not without a paycheck. But at the center of it all, astride a tall gray horse with a smugness that made your blood curdle, sat Silas Hartwell. He didn't look like a monster. No scars, no sneer. He looked polished, educated, dangerous in the way a polished blade is quiet and sharp and sure of its kill. His gaze scanned Caleb with amusement, as if the old rancher were a minor inconvenience. "Thornfield," he called out, voice smooth like oil on water. "We know she's in there." Caleb didn't flinch. "Don't see any wife on my porch." Silas smiled like a man holding all the cards. "Tracks lead straight to your door. That's my horse tied behind your barn. She's inside." "Let's not waste time." The hired guns chuckled, low rifles shifting casually in their hands. Caleb didn't take his eyes off Silas. "Maybe someone borrowed your horse. Happens a lot out here." "You're sloppy," Silas snapped, the smile fading. "I expected better from you. What you expect don't matter," Caleb replied. "All that matters is what happens next." The riders began fanning out, a few stepping closer to the porch, their boots squelching in the mud. Caleb raised his rifle, then, not wavering, not bluffing, and pointed it square at Silas's heart. "First man sets foot on my porch dies." The tension snapped taut. A dozen hammers cocked back in unison, and for a moment the world held its breath. "You're outnumbered," Silas said, voice low and dangerous. 12 to 1. "You shoot me, you don't live long enough to count to 2. Caleb's grip tightened. Might be, but you'll be too dead to enjoy the math. The moment stretched a fragile wire between life and death. Caleb wasn't fooling himself, he knew what he was doing. This wasn't about odds, it was about lines, and Silas Hartwell had crossed one too many. You think she's yours? Caleb said softly. But people ain't property. Not out here. Not anymore. Silas shifted in the saddle. She's my wife. What I do with her is my business. Not anymore. That was the moment it changed. The instant Caleb made the one choice that would either save them both or send him to an unmarked grave beneath the Texas dirt. And somewhere beneath the floorboards, Mercy held her breath, because whatever happened next would rewrite the story of both their lives. The crack of thunder had faded, but a more dangerous storm was just beginning. One made of torches, tempers, and the cold certainty that blood would be spilled before the night was over. Caleb stood firm on his porch rifle, trained on Silas Hartwell, while 12 armed men shifted uneasily in the rain-slicked mud. No one wanted to be the first to die for another man's pride, and even the hired guns were starting to realize this wasn't the easy job they'd been promised. But Silas wasn't blinking. You don't get it, Thornfield, he said, sliding off his horse. His wounded shoulders sagged from where Mercy's name had first been carved into his ego. She belongs to me, and if I have to burn this whole place to the ground to remind her, so be it. Caleb didn't move. That'll be the last fire you ever start. But he saw it, the flicker of resolve in Silas's eyes. The man wasn't bluffing. He turned to two of his brother's men who looked like they'd crawled out of the same mold, smug, strong-backed, born to believe the world owed them something. Burn him out, Silas ordered. Torch the place. That's when Caleb's gut turned cold. The Hartwells weren't just here for intimidation. They were here for ruin. As two men dismounted and grabbed torches from their saddlebags, Caleb felt the crackle of fear, not for himself, but for the girl hidden beneath his floorboards. For Mercy. Back door, Caleb muttered to himself, mind racing. The route trail leads to the creek, if she's quick. But then it hit him. He couldn't run, not now. Not with Mercy counting on him. Not with the weight of her fear still hanging in the corners of the room like smoke. From inside the cabin, he heard it. Her scream. Mercy. He spun too late. One of the Hartwell brothers had found the cellar. The trap door yawned open. A young man, barely more than a boy, dragged her up by the arm, hand clamped over her mouth. Got her, the kid shouted. Caleb's body moved before thought could catch up. He dove from the porch, rolled through the mud, and crashed through the cabin door just as the boy tried to shove Mercy toward Silas. Caleb's shoulder hit him square, sending both of them into the kitchen table. Wood splintered. Dishes shattered. The kid swung wildly, but Caleb was faster, fueled not by rage, but by a decade and a half of solitude finally breaking open. He landed a single punch solid sure, and the boy dropped like a sack of wet grain. You okay, Caleb rasped, panting. Mercy nodded, but her face was pale. He found me. I stayed quiet, just like you said. But he... Not your fault. Caleb cut in, already reaching for the ammo box. Then he looked at her. Really looked. Her sleeves were torn, face smudged with soot, but her eyes, they were sharp now. Awake. Can you shoot? He asked. My father taught me, she whispered. Before he died. He handed her a pistol. Good, because this isn't over. Outside, the torches caught. Flames licked the front of the cabin. Smoke curled up like a serpent made of memory. Silas had lit the fuse, and now everything Caleb had built his piece. His distance, his walls was going up in smoke. But standing beside him was someone worth burning for. The crack of thunder had faded, but a more dangerous storm was just beginning. One made of torches, tempers, and the cold certainty that blood would be spilled before the night was over. Caleb stood firm on his porch rifle, trained on Silas Hartwell, while 12 armed men shifted uneasily in the rain-slicked mud. No one wanted to be the first to die for another man's pride. And even the hired guns were starting to realize this wasn't the easy job they'd been promised. But Silas wasn't blinking. You don't get it, Thornfield, he said, sliding off his horse. His wounded shoulders sagged from where Mercy's name had first been carved into his ego. She belongs to me. And if I have to burn this whole place to the ground to remind her, so be it. Caleb didn't move. That'll be the last fire you ever start. But he saw the flicker of resolve in Silas's eyes. The man wasn't bluffing. He turned to two of his brother's men, who looked like they'd crawled out of the same mold, smug, strong-backed, born to believe the world owed them something. "Burn him out," Silas ordered. "Torch the place." That's when Caleb's gut turned cold. The Hartwells weren't just here for intimidation. They were here for ruin. As two men dismounted and grabbed torches from their saddlebags, Caleb felt the crackle of fear, not for himself, but for the girl hidden beneath his floorboards. For Mercy. "Back door," Caleb muttered to himself, mind racing. "The route trail leads to the creek. If she's quick," but then it hit him. He couldn't run, not now, not with Mercy counting on him, not with the weight of her fear still hanging in the corners of the room like smoke. From inside the cabin, he heard it. Her scream. Mercy. He spun too late. One of the Hartwell brothers had found the cellar. The trap door yawned open. A young man, barely more than a boy, dragged her up by the arm, hand clamped over her mouth. "Got her," the kid shouted. Caleb's body moved before thought could catch up. He dove from the porch, rolled through the mud, and crashed through the cabin door just as the boy tried to shove Mercy towards Silas. Caleb's shoulder hit him square, sending both of them into the kitchen table. Wood splintered, dishes shattered. The kid swung wildly, but Caleb was faster, fueled not by rage, but by a decade and a half of solitude finally breaking open. He landed a single punch solid sure, and the boy dropped like a sack of wet grain. "You okay?" Caleb rasped, panting. Mercy nodded, but her face was pale. "He found me. I stayed quiet just like you said. But not your fault." Caleb cut in, already reaching for the ammo box. Then he looked at her, really looked. Her sleeves were torn, face smudged with soot, but her eyes, they were sharp now. Awake. "Can you shoot?" he asked. "My father taught me," she whispered. "Before he died." He handed her a pistol. "Good. Because this isn't over." Outside, the torches caught. Flames licked the front of the cabin. Smoke curled up like a serpent made of memory. Silas had lit the fuse, and now everything Caleb had built, his peace, his distance, his walls, was going up in smoke. But standing beside him was someone worth burning for. Smoke still curled up from the ruins of the cabin like a ghost, refusing to leave. Caleb stood just outside the barn boots, in the mud rifle in his hands, eyes locked on the last man, standing Silas Hartwell. Behind him, Mercy watched with silent breath, the pistol still clutched at her side. Her face was streaked with soot and sweat, but her spine was straight, and her stare didn't waver. The girl who'd crawled to Caleb's porch in the rain was gone. In her place stood a woman, ready to reclaim herself. "You come this far," Caleb called out to Silas across the clearing. "Now, finish it." Silas stepped forward slowly, gun at his side, eyes like two coals burning with fury. "She's my wife," he spat, voice raw from smoke and pride. "You think this ends here? You think one old man with a gun can change what the world says is mine?" Caleb's jaw clenched. "She's not a thing, and you don't get to own what you can't respect. I loved her. You beat her." Silas's face twisted, wounded, defensive, cornered. "She lied to you. About everything. The baby? There was no baby." A voice cut in from the barn doorway. Mercy stepped forward, slow and steady, pistol down, but ready. "There was just pain. Pain you gave me. And the only thing I'm sorry for is that I didn't run sooner." Silas flinched like her words had struck deeper than any bullet. "You don't get to follow me into the fire and walk away clean," she said, her voice quiet even. "This is where your chase ends." For a long beat, no one moved. Then Silas raised his gun. Caleb fired first. The crack of the rifle split the night like a thunderclap. Silas staggered back, a bloom of red spreading across his chest. He fell hard in the mud, face down, and didn't move again. Silence returned, heavy, final. Only the fire still whispered in the background, slowly dying like the last breath of a long nightmare. Caleb lowered the rifle. Mercy stared at Silas's body for a long moment before whispering, "It's really over, isn't it?" Caleb looked at her, then at the smoldering remains of everything he'd thought he needed to keep himself safe. his solitude, his silence, his walls. He nodded. It's over. But as the wind shifted and carried the smoke away, something else settled in its place, something lighter, cleaner. Not peace, not yet, but the chance for it. They buried the Hartwells at the edge of the woods under gray dawn light. No prayers, no words, just dirt and silence. When the last stone was set, Mercy turned to him. What now? He looked around at what was left, the barn, the horse, the scorched earth. Then at her. Now we build something better. And side by side they walked toward whatever future still waited beyond the fire. The days that followed the fire were quiet, not in the peaceful, untouched way they had once been, but in the solemn, breath-holding way of a land waiting to see what its survivors would do next. The cabin was gone, reduced to a skeletal frame and a bed of charcoal. Caleb stood in the middle of the wreckage on the third morning after the Hartwell's last breath and stared at the ground, where his table used to be, where he'd eaten alone for 15 years, where Mercy had sat across from him, trembling but unbroken. Now the ashes whispered what the fire had taken. But there was still the barn, still thunder, still Mercy. And there was wood to cut, a new home to raise. At first neither of them said the word stay. Caleb didn't ask. Mercy didn't offer. But she was there each morning when he woke, sleeves rolled, hair tied back, a determined set to her jaw that said, I'm not leaving. Not until this place stands again. They worked in tandem. Caleb felled the trees. Mercy measured the beams. She was good with numbers, patient with detail. He noticed how she'd tilt her head when studying a plan, how she'd hum to herself when she thought he wasn't listening. There was no wedding ring, no talk of what they were. Just two people rebuilding something neither of them had ever truly had. By the end of the second week, the foundation was laid. 4 walls rose from the dirt like a promise. She suggested 2 rooms this time. People need space, she said softly, not looking at him. He nodded. And maybe a second chair. Porch gets lonely with just one. That night they sat under the stars beside the half-built home. Caleb passed her a cup of coffee, hot and bitter, just the way she liked it. Mercy cupped it in her hands and stared at the fire they'd made, not the one that had destroyed, but the one they'd chosen. You ever think about what comes next? She asked. He said. Used to think I'd die out here alone. That was the plan. And now? He looked at her. Hair loose around her shoulders. Bruises faded, but the strength still written into every line of her body. Now I think maybe the plan changed. She smiled faintly and leaned back on her elbows. You ever think you'd be grateful for a storm? Caleb chuckled, the sound rough and rare. Not until one dropped you at my gate. They didn't kiss that night. Didn't need to. Some things grow slow, deep like roots under soil still blackened from fire. But there was something unspoken in the air between them, something fragile, something real. And as the stars blinked overhead and the wind carried away the last of the ash, Caleb understood something for the first time in years. You can lose everything. You can burn your whole life down. But if someone stays to build the next chapter with you, then just maybe the story isn't over. The new porch wasn't fancy. Just cedar planks, hand-sanded and sealed with oil Mercy found in town. But to Caleb, it was a cathedral. It faced west toward the open fields where the sun bled gold across the horizon each evening. Toward the same ridge Mercy had stumbled over that first night, soaked to the bone, shaking like a leaf in the wind. That night had burned itself into his bones. But this view, this quiet, stubborn porch, they had built it facing forward, not back. 3 months had passed. The walls were up. The roof held steady through the first September rain. The barn had been cleaned and repaired. And the kitchen smelled of stew again. Mercy's kind. Heavy with spice, just the way Caleb never knew he liked. They didn't speak of the Hartwells anymore, not out of fear, but out of choice. The land had buried them. The law had called it self-defense. The town surprisingly had rallied around Caleb. Maybe because folks always knew what kind of men the Hartwells were. Or maybe because for once, justice hadn't worn a badge, it had worn work-worn boots and carried a rifle out of love, not hate. Mercy kept her last name. Whitfield, Caleb hadn't argued. It was the one piece of her past she wanted to carry, not because it was easy, but because it reminded her she had survived it. They'd married quietly. No preacher, no crowd. Just two signatures, a witness from town, and a vow said with eyes locked instead of words. And now, every night they sat on that porch. Two chairs this time. Hers with a blanket always folded over the arm. His with a carved horse etched into the side rail, a small tribute to Thunder, who had since passed after one final ride through fire. Sometimes they talked about building a bigger barn. Sometimes they didn't talk at all. But every so often Mercy would glance toward the road and whisper, "Think anyone else will ever come out this far?" And Caleb every time would reply, "Only if they're lost or looking for something real." Because what they had now wasn't just a second chance. It was a quiet revolution. In a world that told them survival was enough, they'd chosen more. They'd chosen to feel again, to trust, to stay. And that porch, simple and steady, didn't just face the west. It faced a life neither of them thought they'd ever be worthy of. It faced hope. If this story moved, you don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes in second chances. And if you're ready for another unforgettable journey through the rugged heart of the Wild West, click the next video now. Because some stories only begin after everything else is burned away. Welcome to Legendary West Stories, where the frontier isn't just a place, it's a promise.